Major Discord outage caused by API and database issues. A DevOps Postmortem. Imagine a world where millions of people suddenly lose their ability to speak, chat, or hang out in real time. On January 26, 2022, that was the reality for Discord's massive global user base. It started at 2:49 p.m. EST when the lights went out, not just a flicker, but a total blackout of core services like messaging and voice chat. This wasn't some minor bug. It was a systemic collapse where internal components stopped talking to each other entirely. As engineers scrambled behind the scenes, they weren't just fighting one fire, they were fighting two. While the initial API failure paralyzed communication, a secondary crisis emerged within a critical database cluster, creating a domino effect that threatened to keep the platform offline indefinitely. The scale was massive, and the pressure was mounting as users across the globe were left staring at broken connections. This is how a single point of failure can spiral into a multi-layered infrastructure nightmare. Listen closely, because this is a classic example of how one crack in the foundation can bring down the entire house. On January 26, 2022, Discord hit a wall when an API failure started choking communication between their core services. It wasn't just a simple, it's broken moment. It was a cascading failure. When they tried to patch the initial API issue, they hit a secondary landmine, a failing database cluster. This is where things got ugly for the user experience, as people couldn't log in or even send basic messages. To stop the system from imploding under the weight of the chaos, the team had to implement strict rate limits on logins. It was a desperate move to manage the traffic load while they fought to get that database healthy again. By 1:50 p.m. PST, they finally got over half their users back online, and by 2:12 p.m. PST, the caps were lifted. It's a brutal reminder of how fragile interconnected systems are when one component starts screaming. It was January 26, 2022, and for the millions of users across the globe, Discord was just another day of seamless communication. The platform functioned as a massive, interconnected web where services talked to each other in a constant, high-speed hum. Everything seemed stable until the gears began to grind. At 2:49 p.m. EST, the first crack appeared: a fundamental failure in the Application Programming Interface, or API. This wasn't just a minor glitch. It was a breakdown in communication that effectively silenced the internal dialogue between various services. What started as an API hurdle quickly spiraled into a cascading nightmare for the infrastructure team. They were suddenly fighting a ghost in the machine where services couldn't find their neighbors, setting the stage for a secondary disaster lurking within one of their database clusters. The calm before the storm was about to be shattered by a wave of connectivity failures. The clock hit 2:49 p.m. EST on January 26, 2022, and the silence began. It wasn't just a flicker, it was a total communications blackout. The initial alarm bells were triggered by a fundamental failure in the API, the very backbone that allows Discord services to talk to one another. When the API choked, users were suddenly locked out of voice chats and messages alike. But as the on-call engineers dove into the wreckage, they hit a second wall, a failing database cluster. This wasn't just one fire, it was a cascading failure where solving the first problem exposed a deeper structural rot. To keep the system from collapsing entirely under the weight of desperate reconnection attempts, the team had to slam on the brakes by enforcing strict rate limits on logins. It was a desperate game of triage, trying to stabilize the database while managing the sheer volume of traffic before they could finally begin the slow process of letting users back into the fold. It started as a standard communication breakdown, but in a distributed system of this scale, a single crack can quickly turn into a canyon. At 2:49 p.m. EST on January 26, 2022, an API failure effectively severed the lines of communication between internal services. This wasn't just a localized glitch, it was a systemic paralysis that prevented users from logging in or sending messages. But as the team scrambled to patch the initial API hole, the pressure shifted elsewhere. The sudden shift in traffic and state caused a secondary crisis. One of the database clusters began to buckle under the strain. By 12:07 p.m. PST, they were fighting a two-front war against both the broken API and a failing database cluster. They had to slam on the brakes with login rate limits just to keep the remaining infrastructure from collapsing entirely while they stabilized the core. The chaos didn't start with a single explosion. It was a cascading failure that exposed just how fragile interconnected systems can be. It all began at 1449 EST on January 26, 2022, when an underlying issue with the API effectively severed communication between critical services. Imagine the backend suddenly going deaf and mute services couldn't talk to each other, and the platform ground to a halt. But the real nightmare started when they tried to fix it. As the team tackled the primary API failure, a secondary crisis erupted within one of their database clusters. This wasn't just a localized glitch. It was a domino effect where the initial instability put undue strain on the infrastructure. To keep the system from collapsing entirely under the weight of the backlog, they had to implement aggressive rate limits on logins. It was a desperate move to throttle the floodgate while they fought to get that database cluster healthy and stable before the lights went out for good. When things go sideways in a distributed system, the blast radius doesn't just stay contained, it spreads like a wildfire. On January 26, 2022, Discord felt that heat firsthand. It wasn't just a minor glitch. An API failure effectively severed communication between critical services, grinding everything from message delivery to voice chats to a halt. The fallout was massive, impacting the core experience for a huge swath of their user base. To keep the wheels from falling off completely while they wrestled with a secondary database cluster issue, they had to hammer on some aggressive login rate limits. It wasn't until 1:50 p.m. PST that more than half of the users were actually back online and functioning normally. By 2:12 p.m. PST, they finally pulled those limits entirely. For a few hours, the digital town square was silent, leaving thousands of users stranded in the dark. The chaos started at 14:49 EST on January 26, 2022, when a primary API failure effectively severed the lines of communication between internal services. It wasn't just a single point of failure, it was a domino effect. As the team scrambled to patch the initial API breach, they hit a secondary wall. A database cluster started buckling under the strain. By 12:07 p.m. PST, the engineers realized the situation was spiraling and had to move into damage control mode, implementing strict rate limits on logins just to keep the system from collapsing entirely. It was a desperate dance of balancing stability against accessibility. They didn't just flip a switch. They waited until the database was confirmed healthy at 12:29 PST before slowly easing those restrictions. By 13:50 p.m., over half of the users were back in the fold, and by 14:12 p.m., they finally cleared all rate limits, grinding out a victory against a cascading infrastructure nightmare. The fix wasn't a single magic switch. It was a grueling exercise in triage and traffic management. Once the team identified the core API failure, they hit a second wall, a database cluster that couldn't handle the strain of the sudden communication breakdown. To stop the bleeding, they threw up a login rate limit to throttle the flood of incoming requests while they stabilized the infrastructure. By 12:07 p.m. PST, they were fighting both fires at once. It was only after the database showed signs of health that they began the slow, methodical process of easing those limits back up. By 12:29 p.m. PST, internal error rates finally hit nominal levels, allowing them to let users back in gradually. They didn't just flip a switch. They choreographed a recovery until 12 p.m. PST, when the final rate limits were dropped and the system breathed again. This war highlights the brutal reality of cascading failures in a distributed architecture. When that initial API failure struck at 2:49 p.m. EST on January 26, it didn't just break communication, it triggered a secondary crisis within a database cluster. The takeaway here is clear. In complex systems, a single point of failure can metastasize into something much larger if not contained. We saw how critical it is to have robust monitoring that can sniff out these shadow issues immediately after the primary fire is put out. Furthermore, tactical use of rate limits during the recovery phase proved essential. By throttling traffic when the database became healthy at 12:29 p.m. PST, the team prevented a stampede of reconnecting users from crushing the system again. It's a stark reminder there that defensive engineering like proactive rate limiting and rapid response capabilities is what keeps a service from collapsing under its own weight during a crisis. That's how Discord turned a very bad day into a lesson. If this saved you an outage, subscribe for the next postmortem.